the service of Terry Payton at other opportunities, but this is our first opportunity as this committee and our first meeting since his retirement. So it's, I'd certainly want to convey our immense thanks to Terry Payton for his exceptional service to the people of Saskatchewan, to the public, to government, to the legislature. He's served for many years. In fact, he's the longest serving provincial comptroller in Saskatchewan's history. 26 years as provincial comptroller of Saskatchewan, 38 years of service with the Ministry of Finance. And he's always been exceptional for this committee to work with and for the people of Saskatchewan. So thank you to Terry. We know he's an avid, he loves the outdoors, and it's, you know, upland season is into full swing. Pheasant season is coming. We know he's a big trout fisher. We wish him many, many happy days on the lake and in the field. I'd like to welcome and introduce the our provincial auditor, Tara Clement, and officials in attendance from the provincial auditor's office. They'll be introduced throughout the day as they present to the various chapters that they've been focused on. I'll table the following documents: Pack 6029, Ministry of Health, responses to questions raised at the March 1st, 2022 meeting. Pack 6129, Ministry of Education, Report of Public Losses, December 1st, 2021 to May 31st, 2022. Pack 6229, Provincial Auditor of Saskatchewan, First Quarter Financial Forecast for the 3 months ending June 30th, 2022. Pack 6329, Ministry of Health, Report of Public Losses, April 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2022. Pack 6429, Ministry of Finance, Report of Public Losses, April 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2022. Pack 6529, Ministry of Advanced Education, Report of Public Losses, April 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2022. Pack 6629, Ministry of Finance, Government Response to Standing Committee on Public Accounts, second report, dated August 31st, 2022. We'll turn our attention now to our first considerations of the day and focus on the Ministry of Education and the related auditors' reports. I want to thank those that have joined us here today, the officials that have joined us. Deputy Minister Matza, thank you very much for being here along with your officials. What I'd ask you to do is just briefly introduce your officials that are here, refrain from entering in on the reports just now. I'll kick it over then to the Provincial Auditor's Office to make presentation. Then it's back to you, and then we'll open it up for questioning. So, Deputy Minister.
Thank you. So in terms of introduction, I have David Bain here. He's my Assistant Deputy Minister of Corporate and Student Services. And I have Corinne Barnett. She's Executive Director of Corporate Finance. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the latest reports and the recommendations under review. On behalf of the Ministry of Advanced Education and the post-secondary sector, I want to thank you and the Provincial Auditor and their staff for the continued professionalism throughout the various audits and processes that have taken place in our ministry over the years. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you as well. I'll table at this time PAC 6729, Ministry of Advanced Education status update, dated September 6, 2022. Thank you to officials who have prepared that. It allows us to focus our line of questioning here today. I'll turn it over at this point to the Provincial Auditor to make comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members and officials. With me today is Mr. Trevor St. John, who was the Deputy Provincial Auditor that was formerly in charge of the portfolio that included the Ministry of Advanced Education. He has now moved to the Finance Division and will be responsible for leading the audit of the government summary financial statements in the next year. I also have behind me as well Mrs. Kim Lowe. She is our liaison with this committee and she will be here all day with us, so I won't reintroduce her for every presentation, but she will be coming to the table to do a presentation at one point. So For the 8 chapters that we do have before us with regards to the Ministry of Advanced Education, Trevor's going to present the first 4 chapters all together, and then the last 2 chapters together as well, as they are all related. There is one new recommendation for the committee's consideration, and basically Trevor will pause after each presentation so that the committee can deliberate and consider the information before them. I'd like to obviously thank the Deputy Minister of Advanced Education, to her and her staff for all the cooperation that was extended to us during the course of our work. With that, I'll turn it over to Trevor. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll present the first 4 chapters together. Chapter 1 of our 2018, 2019, and 2020 reports in Volume 2, and Chapter 2 of our 2021 report in Volume 2. These report the results of our annual integrated audits of the Ministry of Advanced Education and its agencies. Generally, these chapters also report on certain agencies like regional colleges and some funds overseen by the ministry. The financial statements of these listed agencies in these chapters were reliable. The ministry and each agency complied with relevant authorities and had effective rules and procedures to safeguard public resources, other than noted in our recommendations, and I'll now go over each of these recommendations. The first recommendation reported in our 2018 chapter relates to the recording of transfers related to a strategic investment fund the federal government had not yet authorized, which resulted in the ministry recording revenue and expenses in the wrong fiscal years and missing contractual rights and obligations to post-secondary institutions. We continue to recommend the Ministry of Advanced Education follow Canadian generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector to record transfers in its financial records. Inconsistent application of Canadian public sector accounting standards can impact the reliability of financial reports and can decrease the public's confidence in the accuracy of the government's financial reports. This also affects management's ability to accurately track its future obligations and related revenue sources. In our 2019 and 2020 reports, we continued to report that this recommendation had not been addressed. In our 2021 report, we noted that the recommendation was implemented and the ministry followed Canadian generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector to properly record transfers in its financial records during the year. Errors related to the Strategic Investment Fund transfers had wound down. The second and last recommendation in the 2018 chapter, we reported that the ministry signed an adequate agreement on disaster recovery of computer systems and data with the Ministry of Central Services and tested its disaster recovery plan. The outstanding recommendation from 2008 was considered implemented in 2018. The first recommendation in our 2019 report is a new recommendation for the committee's consideration. This section starts on page 19, and we recommend the Ministry of Advanced Education adequately monitor the activities of subsidiaries incorporated by the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina. As part of its responsibility for the post-secondary education sector, the ministry monitors the activities of each university. However, those monitoring activities did not extend to include the university's subsidiaries. The universities, on a combined basis, had 6 subsidiaries as of April 1st, 2021, with revenue and expenses of about $50 million. As the subsidiaries are fully controlled and part of the universities, the ministry's monitoring activities should include activities of these subsidiaries. Without adequate oversight, there is a risk that university subsidiaries could undermine the powers granted to the parent universities. For example, under legislation and with certain universities, activities requiring ministerial approval. In turn, this could result in harm to a university's reputation or a negative financial impact. We continue to make the recommendation to the ministry in our 2020 and 2021 reports and note that it was not yet implemented at April 1st, 2021. During 2020 to 2021, the ministry indicated it was working with the University of Saskatchewan to establish a framework for monitoring the university's subsidiaries. I will now pause for the committee's consideration.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We have one new recommendation, but I'll turn it over to the Deputy Minister for brief comment, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. With regard to the recommendation, the first one with regard to the recommendation of the Ministry of Advanced Education follow Canadian generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector to record transfers, the ministry agrees with the provincial auditor that that implementation recommendation is implemented. With regard to the recommendation to monitor the activities of subsidiaries incorporated by the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Regina, the Ministry and the University of Saskatchewan signed a memorandum of understanding in August 2022 to establish a framework for monitoring the university subsidiaries, including the sharing of board packages and financial updates. The signing of the MOU will formalize a process for monitoring the activities of the subsidiaries of the U of S. The ministry believes this process will fully address the provincial auditor's recommendations. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for all the work on this front. It's important work, and thank you for the presentation. I'll open it up now to committee members. Ms. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morning, everyone. Thank you to the officials for being here this morning. Given the consistency between some of the chapters, perhaps I'll just address the issues individually as opposed to going through chapter by chapter. And with that said, I did, understanding it is now implemented, just want to revisit briefly the disagreement as it relates to the Strategic Investment Fund. Being a relatively new member of the committee, and perhaps this is a question best put to the auditor, could you expand upon the nature of the disagreement?
So it came down to basically under accounting standards, there's a section that government transfers, and from our perspective, the ministry was recording revenue before it should have been. So there would have been money coming across from the federal government that we did not consider. We would have been doing some confirming with the federal government as well. And it wasn't in our purview as well as theirs basically authorized, and therefore revenue shouldn't have been recorded. So, and it was being recorded earlier. And then as a result, the money transferred to the ministry, and my understanding is it goes out to then the post-secondary educational institutions too, but expenses were being recorded at that time, again, earlier than we would anticipate under that sort of, I guess, accounting standard. So it was, there's nothing from the bottom line perspective, though, in terms of revenues were overstated as well as expenses, is my understanding.
Pardon me to clarify. So revenues and expenses were both overstated?
Yes, so it had no overall bottom line income or deficit impact.
And understanding that these were transfers that were not yet authorized, they were ongoing over several years.
Correct. It would have been because of the terms of the agreement almost, and at what point were they? So money perhaps even would have flowed probably at the beginning. Some perhaps, and it wouldn't have necessarily been, though, it shouldn't be recorded as revenue till it's you sort of earned and you're entitled to it.
And forgive me, has the Strategic Investment Fund now wound down?
Imagine that agreement is now, yeah, it's almost like all the money's now been provided, earned, and recorded as such.
Okay, so it's less of a agreement over the accounting standard and just more
We
of
are
the program
happy that, yes, everything's almost like, yeah, sort of cycled through and went away, and we have no heirs remaining.
Okay. Thank you. And to the officials, what, understanding this program has now wrapped, what was the rationale for the way that it was recorded on the advanced ed side?
In the ministry's opinion was that the agreement signed with the federal government did not contain any eligibility criteria, and public sector accounting standards are clear, we feel, in regards to eligibility criteria, in that a transfer without that criteria should be recognized as revenue when the transfer is authorized. As such, the ministry recognized the entire amount of the transfer as revenue when the federal government authorized the transfer. So the provincial auditor's opinion was that the federal government's intent was that this funding had specific eligibility criteria, and we disagreed, and that's why we accounted for the revenue in a different manner.
And are you aware, as to whether this was a disagreement shared by other ministries of advanced education or their counterparts in other jurisdictions in Canada, or is this unique to the Saskatchewan Ministry of Advanced Ed?
I'm not aware of those, no.
Perhaps I could put that question back to the auditor then. Was it just our Ministry of Advanced Education here in Saskatchewan, or are you aware of other disagreements with ministries in other jurisdictions over this this funding?
Go ahead, do you know?
I'm not aware of disagreements between other ministries in Canada, so.
And was this something that the Ministry of Advanced Education considered, looking into how other ministries? I would imagine, perhaps I'm mistaken, that this is a fund with national applicability. So if other jurisdictions were accounting for it differently, is there a reason, I guess, for the unique situation that Saskatchewan's ministry found itself in?
In this particular case, our position was developed in consultation with the Provincial Controller's Office. So I don't know if they can comment on whether there was other provinces that took that position.
Yes, I'm not aware of a situation in other provinces. I would say that generally, when it comes to accounting for government transfers, it's a reasonably complex area for governments, and that by and large we have a very good relationship with the provincial auditor's office, and we've sort of worked out, for the most part, when there's eligibility criteria, what authorization means. But there are just those odd times when we get to a spot where we kind of agree to disagree. It's pretty rare, I think. Overall we're in good shape in terms of the relationship there. This was just one of those situations where I think we agreed with the ministry's assessment, and so agreed to disagree with the auditor. And there are a few of those, but it happens.
Thank you, Mr. Beta. Perhaps just a follow-up question for you then, recognizing, Saskatchewan does receive federal transfers, and not knowing the details of the criteria for the Strategic Investment Fund, is this a situation that you've noted the disagreements between ministries and your institution, the provincial auditor, are few and far between. However, has this occurred with other ministries and federal transfers or programs that would be similar, or is this a fairly unique situation?
I think this one is reasonably unique. We might have one other one that we have sort of a kind of a standing disagreement on. But yeah, this is not a common occurrence, and I don't recall the details of this one. I just I think that the deputy had it right, that we just had didn't observe in our opinion that there were eligibility criteria, and we felt the transfer had been authorized, and that according to our interpretation of the standard would have led to revenue. And there's a difference of opinion on the other side, and I think it's on this one it's worked out well that the accounting applied resulted in both an overstatement of revenue and expense, and so there was no bottom line net impact. It's more concerning when there's not a match there. So yeah.
Chair Hargrave.
Yeah, just a quick question. The provincial auditor, the controller, but you never checked with other jurisdictions. You just assume that you haven't heard of any. That's correct? You said not that I'm aware of, which would indicate to me that you haven't checked with Manitoba or BC.
Just
or
comment that we do have a forum, so we do have like a public accounts forum where really all the auditor generals, I'm sure the provincial controller also has a bit of a group where we might, you're right, we might check with our colleagues and figure out in the event that the agreement is being applied from that federal perspective and all the provinces are receiving a similar, funding scenario and the agreement reads the same. But sometimes there is circumstances, I would say, that make us unique, or the way we've negotiated and the way that contract's written. So there is times that we can't always be exactly the same. Also, again, complex accounting standard, the way my colleagues across Canada and the provincial controllers may interpret that section and the agreement may be different than other provinces. So we can sometimes be not totally aligned, I would say.
From the controller's point of view, you never checked with other provinces or the deputy ministers.
I don't think that we checked with other provinces on this one. We do check with other provinces from time to time, but I think as the provincial auditor noted, sometimes the agreements are worded slightly differently, which can impact the accounting. And sometimes there's sort of a, in the grayness of how transfers are accounted for, different jurisdictions may have reached a different sort of point on that, in that gray zone in terms of, what they think would be the appropriate accounting. So sometimes we wouldn't agree with another jurisdiction in any event. So I think by and large, it's a complex standard. It's a pretty good standard. Certainly before that standard came into place, there were a lot more disagreements across the country, and I think within our respective offices as well. So it's a much improved situation, but there you have it.
Further questions, committee members? Ms. Young.
Chair, just a couple more on this topic, and then I'll move on. So forgive me, I haven't gone through all the chapters and done the math myself, but what was the total value, like how much money, essentially, over the, I believe it was the 3-year federal-provincial agreement?
There was a total of $65 million. That's how much they received for our 7 institutions.
Perfect. And which institutions received funding through this program?
The U of R, U of S, Parkland College, Gabriel Demont Institute, Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies, and Saskatchewan Polytechnic.
And were these, forgive me for not having the program criteria, were these institutions, did these institutions then apply to the ministry for funding under this program, or was it distributed by the ministry where it saw fit? And
So, excuse me, the ministry would have been involved in establishing the selection criteria for the various projects and would have done an intake of project interest from the various institutions, and then done a bit of a ranking process, and then flowed the federal money to the institutions, and with half coming from the federal government and the other half being raised by the institutions themselves.
thank you. And anticipating my next questions, could you speak to the criteria used to evaluate those projects as well as the projects that were funded?
So the criteria used are based on sort of what I would call strategic requirements of the sector. There's need factors as well that are considered. Some of these institutions, will have requirements to expand programs or, address some critical infrastructure issues. And each of those would be considered as part of the decision-making process, along with whatever criteria that the federal government may have in terms of, limitations or parameters that they want to put around the program as well.
So critical infrastructure, that could involve physical infrastructure. Could that involve information technology? It seems like a fairly fairly broad, and this isn't a critical question. It seems like fairly broad criteria, which I could see being quite beneficial to institutions.
Yeah. What I would note is, given the list of institutions involved and some of the nature of some of the projects, for example, there were a number of projects that were related to Indigenous institutions. So, growing the participation of Indigenous students in terms of post-secondary education was sort of a key priority at that point in time as well.
So if I'm correct in understanding that there would have been a great number of projects funded with this money, are you able to provide some examples just to give the committee a sense of?
There were 10 projects that were actually funded, and certainly you're correct, there would have been more than that. That interest would have been expressed in, and the criteria would have been used to create a short list of projects. In terms of the actual nature of the various projects, I'm afraid I don't have that detailed information. But, our capital initiatives across the sector happen on an annual basis. I mean, this happened to involve some federal cost sharing or federal funding. But, at any one time, we've got quite a number of projects going on. So I do know there were 10 projects. The Deputy Minister listed which institutions were part of the program. But in terms of actual details, that we would have to provide outside the meeting.
Thank you. And overall, it was a successful project, or pardon me, a successful program for the sector and for all of the partners involved.
I think it's fair to say that, yes. There's, like any sector, needs for capital and infrastructure are always important in terms of meeting strategic goals and that sort of thing, and delivering on mandates. And again, we do have a long list of interests, and of course, with like any ministry in government, we only have so many funds to provide towards those projects. So yes, and again, there is a lot of effort put into prioritizing the list, making sure that we do get the best projects with the best possible impact to the top of the list. And again, I think if the institutions were here to speak to each of the projects, they would be very appreciative of the opportunity that the funding provided.
And my last question here, with the $65 million obviously being a decent amount of money, certainly to the average person, but I would anticipate being a bit of a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of capital needs in any ministry in any province. I guess my final question would be, you noted some cost sharing, and I'm curious as to the nature of that, if it was if the dollars were expected to be matched by the institution, and how that $65 million figures in the broader context of the infrastructure needs of your ministry. Is it how much of an impact, I suppose, did it make in the? I'm not knowing what the infrastructure deficit would be off the top of my head.
Yeah, as an investment in infrastructure, it was quite substantial. In the case of Indigenous institutions, the federal funding could be utilized to cover 100% of the cost of the project, but in the case of the other institutions, it was 50%, with the institutions expected to raise those funds from other sources. And in terms of sort of quantifying, the impact across the sector, yes, there are always lots of needs and wants in any sector, but it was certainly a substantial investment at the time, and makes quite an impact. And of course, there's other provincial dollars that are invested on an annual basis that also helps to make sure that we have solid infrastructure to create a positive learning experience, all those kind of things within our sector. So. In terms of, deferred maintenance, that sort of thing, yes, there is more work definitely that needs to be done across the sector. But just like these new capital investments, when it comes to our deferred maintenance investment, again, criteria are utilized to prioritize to make sure we are having the greatest possible impact, and also addressing the greatest needs in our sector as well.
Thank you.
Further questions on this recommendation or any of the others? Maybe just to confirm then, the one recommendation that's not implemented, the new recommendation from chapter 1 of 2019 report, you've laid out the actions that have been taken, and it's the full expectation that there will be that this will be implemented now in the fall, this fall. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Young?
I did have more questions about other recommendations. I was just
Just keep her going.
totally finished off, I think, thoroughly canvassed the strategic infrastructure fund. Perhaps, so pardon me for being unclear about that. Just one question about the past recommendation from 2018 as it related to the adequate disaster recovery agreement, which spoke to, I believe, the university subcontracting through central services for a third party to deliver these disaster recovery services, and that the service provider was engaged in kind of an ongoing successful testing and maintenance of that. I guess 2 quick questions here. Does this remains accurate and current, and there's no concerns as it would relate to disaster recovery for the sector? And then perhaps if there are any concerns or ongoing or changes as would relate to one client service model or cybersecurity for the institutions.
So maybe I'll just start and then David can continue. This is a system that is within the ministry, so not with regard to the sector, so it's a ministry system. In terms of its current status, I'll let David take it.
So when this issue was raised, the one client service model was in what I think the technical people would call an unsupported situation. We were not at the current supported level of the underlying software. That work was done to get it up to a supported level, and then the disaster recovery plan and the testing was implemented subsequent to that. This system is about 20 or so years old, so it is sort of getting to end of life. And each of the participants in the one client service model, which includes our ministry, includes the Apprenticeship Commission, the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training, and the regional colleges in Saskatchewan, we're each working on developing new systems to replace the one client service model. Because it is, like I say, an older system, but it also doesn't necessarily offer the level of client service that new technologies provide. So we are headed in a positive direction.
And sorry, Mr. Bain, I do have one follow-up question. You said these, the different organizations that were covered by the one client system, they're now working to develop independent systems as opposed to one consolidated?
That is correct, yes.
So perhaps moving on to the recommendations as they relate to the Ministry of Advanced Education adequately monitoring the activities of subsidiaries incorporated by the U of S and the U of R. One general question to start, likely for the auditors. I note in the recommendations that the recommendation is that the ministry, at least initially, inadequately monitors the consolidated activities of the province's 2 universities. For the committee, what constitutes a consolidated activity?
So from a consolidated perspective, it'd be anything that I guess the university almost controls. So these subsidiaries really are controlled, and then as a result, those subsidiaries would also, from that financial perspective, be rolled into the financial picture of the universities as well.
So would those activities be exclusively financial, or would consolidated activities cover off
It could be
entirety?
broader from that operational standpoint. So I think from that monitoring standpoint, it could be about, I guess, capital. I guess that has a financial impact. I mean, the financial might be the most concerning, but it would be anything from that key perspective that they, and from that legislative authority side, that they should be sort of in the know. So, anything from maybe acquiring debt or capital and so forth.
And for the subsidiary institutions, are there, sorry, this is not an area I have a great deal of background knowledge. Are there any post-secondary institutions who would be, or degree granting institutions, I'm not sure if that's a difference, who would be exempt from monitoring or oversight by the U of R or the U of S?
So depending on which institution and sort of which legislative level of oversight exists. Like, for example, with our two universities, each of them has an act. The act is very specific about the powers of the minister and the expectations of the relationship with the ministry. And so in a number of those cases, we, the minister, will be approving certain activities. But we also have other institutions that do receive public funding. I would think, for example, the Indigenous institutions, where we don't necessarily have a provincial act, and therefore, while we still have a very positive and direct relationship with them, the notion of approval would be different. So we might be noting receiving, say, a business plan or something like that, as opposed to approving that plan. And so again, it just depends on which institution one might be referencing, and again, each of them, in some cases, will have their own act, and those that don't, we still have working relationships with them because they are still an important part of our post-secondary education system.
So perhaps a better question for me to have asked would be, could you list the U of S's subsidiaries then for the committee?
So
in terms of the University of Saskatchewan subsidiaries that this new MOU would apply to, there are 5 of them. One of them is number 621602 Saskatchewan Limited. The second one was Agravita Canada Inc. The third one was Canadian Light Source Inc. Fourth one was Prairie Swine Center Inc. And the fifth one was the Sylvia Fedoruk Canadian Centre for Nuclear Innovation.
And pardon me, what do the first 2 do? The numbered corporation threw me. I have no idea what it does.
So the first one, 621602, is the company was incorporated to participate in real estate investment activities. For example, Preston Crossing in Saskatoon.
Okay.
Second one?
Yes.
Agrivita, the mandate of the company is to secure funding for various sources of funding research scientists and the conduct of research towards the development of informed Canadian public policy and public confidence in agriculture products.
So help. I guess I'm curious. In reading the recommendations, I believe it spoke to monitoring being necessary, to mitigate potential risks to the institutions, as well as, ensure these incorporated subsidiaries were fulfilling their primary roles. which I'll admit I understood to be kind of a pedagogical or instructional or research-based. Was that a mistaken understanding, or I guess I'm very curious, how does a real estate investment corporation help the University of Saskatchewan realize its core goals?
So in terms of the 5 subsidiaries that were part of this recommendation, oftentimes an institution, in this case the University of Saskatchewan, will establish a subsidiary for a number of reasons. One, to sort of separate the work. And as you've correctly pointed out, in other cases, it's because the mandate of that subsidiary varies significantly from that of a university. And again, I don't know all the detail and the background, but for example, the real estate investment activities, that's something that is not part of the mandate of a university. And so there's always a potential risk that if an institution does it directly, they can start to impact their charitable status and their not-for-profit status. So by creating a subsidiary, it helps to sort of shield them from that concern or criticism, but it also helps to shield them from the risk of that particular entity, and the activities that it takes on. So, if it is the type of work that you were describing related to teaching, research, community service, that would be part of, in this case, the University of Saskatchewan proper. But when they start to take on activities that are perhaps a bit outside their mandate, but related, they will utilize the subsidiary. And I think that, the real estate investment is a great example where, they have these excess lands. They're very valuable lands. They can be used for research and other academic activities, but they can also be used for commercial activities, and therefore establishing a separate body to do that work makes sense from the university's perspective.
And is there a particular reason or historic nature to why the U of S has subsidiaries and the U of R does not?
I think the U of S, being a medical doctoral and very research-intensive institution, winds up taking on certain activities and maybe having certain opportunities that a smaller institution like the U of R maybe would not have access to. So again, it has to do with the complexity of the institution. The U of S being an endowment land organization, they have a lot of very valuable real estate or property in Saskatoon. And again, in the past that may have been used for research or academic purposes, but now perhaps it has a higher potential value. And so again, I think, it's the nature of the institution and the fact that being a research-intensive medical doctoral, the University of Saskatchewan just is involved with, a range of activities. And I guess the final point I would make on this is, our relationship with the institutions, we are encouraging them to make sure they're fully fulfilling their mandate. And that may be, for example, taking research, and I'm thinking of like the Light Source or the Prairie Swine Center, taking research that's happening in the lab bench and working towards commercialization and getting value out of that research. And so, for example, the University of Saskatchewan has substantial earnings from research royalties, so licensing of some of their research, which again from the ministry's perspective, I expect from the province's perspective, we see as highly valuable. And so sometimes you need these types of structures to be able to make that happen, to get value out of the research that's taking place at the institutions.
Thank you. And you noted there are these 5 subsidiaries covered by the recommendation. How many are there that would not be covered by this recommendation? And what's the distinction as to why some would be included and some not?
So I believe there may be 2 or 3 or 4 others that are maybe not consolidated, but I may look to the provincial auditor for a response to that question, why these 5 and not maybe the others as well. But because there are some other entities that the University of Saskatchewan is involved with.
So, to my knowledge, there's one other subsidiary that is consolidated that wasn't named. It was the Alumni Association. It's due to a change in governance structure, the university gained control of it. It would be very, very small. I'm assuming that's probably why. I shouldn't assume, I suppose, but it's very, very small. It's very low risk. There's other agencies that the university has involvement with. A good example would be Prairie Diagnostic Services, which is sort of like a joint venture between the Ministry of Agriculture and the university. It's not consolidated by the university, and there are other agencies that they would have involvement with, but they don't have control of. So they have potentially significant influence, or just some influence or some involvement.
Thank you. And I suppose this will be a question to both the officials from advanced education and then also to the provincial auditors. Given the planned actions for implementation, which really appear to be kind of a greater integration of the pre-existing governance reporting that looks like it's taking place within these subsidiaries, and just ensuring that moves up to the U of S, I suppose to both the officials and then to the provincial auditor. Do you feel this is sufficient for mitigating those potential risks and ensuring adequate level of accountability and transparency?
Yes, we do.
So we'll be looking at the extent of the MOU, and then it'll probably be about the fulfillment of what's been agreed to within that, obviously, understanding that's been reached, as long as that is occurring as such. And it does seem to cover, as I guess Trevor's indicated, sort of those significant subsidiaries that we envisioned. I would assume it will be addressed this year.
Thank you. And one final question on this area. In my understanding, memorandums of understanding are fairly friendly documents, but not necessarily binding. Was this consciously chosen as the vehicle to ensure this? And if so, why?
So the University of Saskatchewan Act does not apply to U.S. subsidiaries, so the MOU was the tool that we thought was most appropriate to allow us to have this oversight.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the nuance in regards to the legislation not applying, and then why an MOU would be the appropriate choice of agreement.
So the legislation didn't give us the authority to have the oversight over the subsidiaries. So a MOU was deemed to be the most appropriate tool to gain an oversight. And with our relationship with the U of S, we think it will be effective.
Great. Thank you. Moving on, perhaps, to actually just one question on, and forgive me, on an implemented recommendation on the unapproved capital projects. Understanding this process has been implemented since 2018. I am just, pardon me, Chapter 27.
We're going to turn our attention, we're going to close the consideration, we're doing the first four.
Oh.
And then we'll be turning our consideration to 27 in just a brief moment, no problem at all. And that'll be the time we can take questions? Any further questions with respect to the first 4 chapters that we lumped together for consideration? Those would be the 3 chapter 1s and then chapter 2.
Sorry, just clarification for me, so I'm not messing up the ongoing flow of the committee. We are going through these sequentially as they are laid out in the agenda, correct?
That's right. We lumped the first 4 together. You'll see chapter 27 will be presented on independently by the auditor, and we'll kind of keep the updates going as far as which ones are grouped together and which ones are individual. Any further with the ones that are before us, the 3 chapter 1s and chapter 2? No. So we have one new recommendation here, and that's in the Chapter 19, Volume 2 report, Chapter 1, Recommendation Number 1. I'd welcome a motion to concur and note progress, as has been noted. Would someone care to move? Moved by Mr. Harrison. All agreed? That's carried. I would now welcome a recommendation to conclude consideration of the 2018 Report Volume 2, Chapter 1, 2020 Report Volume 2, Chapter 1, 2021 Report Volume 2, Chapter 2. Would someone care to move? Mr. Nerline moves. All agreed?
Chair?
Oh, sorry. Mr. Chair.
Did you miss 2019 Report Volume 2, Chapter 1?
We have a new recommendation on that one, so we don't need to move a conclusion of consideration the same way. So with respect to those chapter from the 3 chapters that were identified from 2018, 2020, 21, moved by Mr. Nerline. All agreed? That's carried. Okay, we'll turn our attention now to Chapter 27, and we'll just focus on that one chapter for this time, and we'll kick it back over to the Provincial Auditor for presentation.
Thank you. Chapter 27 of the 2018 report, Volume 2, reports the results of our first follow-up of an audit we did on the Ministry of Advanced Education's processes for approving post-secondary capital projects. Advanced Education coordinates infrastructure planning for the post-secondary sector with SAS Builds. We made one recommendation in our 2016 performance audit. The recommendation related to providing timely feedback to post-secondary institutions about capital project requests that are not approved. In August 2018, the ministry gave post-secondary institutions feedback about unapproved requests for funding for capital projects related to the 2018-19 budget cycle. In addition, the ministry drafted a process to provide post-secondary institutions with annual feedback as part of its infrastructure planning cycle. We concluded the ministry had implemented the recommendation. I will pause now for the committee's considerations.
Thank you for the presentation, the focus of the work. I'll turn it over to the Deputy Minister for a brief comment.
So the ministry agrees that this recommendation is implemented. We continue to communicate with the post-secondary institutions early in the new fiscal year to provide feedback on projects that were not successful in obtaining approval for funding.
Thanks for the work on this front, and I know we've got a question that's coming. Ms. Young.
Thank you. And just to clarify, to ensure I'm not canvassing things the committee's already covered ad nauseum, since implementation, this is the first time the recommendation has come back to the committee, correct?
That's right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
This was our first follow-up.
First follow-up.
Yes,
follow-up.
yeah.
Okay.
So first time that, yeah. They addressed immediately the next time we looked.
Great. Thank you. So with that context, to the officials, I'm wondering if you could describe in greater detail the planning cycle and capital project approval process listed in the recommendation.
So the process is linked to our annual budgeting cycle and now has significant involvement from the Ministry of SAS Builds and Procurement. And so with each call for capital, the various criteria that we will use to assess projects will be shared with our institutions, or post-secondary institutions, and they will then submit projects. The team at SAS Builds and Procurement will then use those criteria to evaluate the list. That list will then be brought to the ministry, and specifically the minister, for final review and approval before it goes back into the SAS builds and procurement process for sort of final evaluation by that particular board.
And would those criteria and priority areas be relatively consistent, but likely have some change year to year?
Yes, I think that's a fair description. So in the case of the criteria, certainly linked to strategic priorities at the institution, linked to strategic priorities of the ministry and the provincial government. Health and safety concerns also figure prominently in the criteria if there's something that needs to be addressed for those reasons. But there will be tweaks from cycle to cycle, but overall fairly consistent.
And does that, it sounds like a bit of a dialogue between the institutions, the ministry, and SAS builds and procurement is in the opinion of officials. Is that working fairly smoothly? Yes. And the planning cycle, that is just annual. There's no multi-year planning.
Of both.
Okay, and what is the longer term planning cycle that would be used by the ministry?
In terms of the cycle, maybe I'd ask you to ask SAS Builds what their longer term cycle is in terms of the approval of capital. It's within their mandate.
Okay, so within the ministry itself, there would not be, for example, like 5-year capital planning or 3-year, but I'm picking numbers arbitrarily. I guess I'm.
So by the nature of the projects, yes, for sure, there is multi-year planning because some of the larger projects are multi-year in nature.
And are the factors considered by the ministry when used to evaluate proposals, are these factors consistent across institutions, understanding there may be some change year to year, but are the same factors and criteria used to evaluate institutions that would be covered off by the Ministry of Advanced Education in terms of capital?
Capital planning and review process is centralized within SAS Builds to allow for consistency in terms of criteria.
And has the response from sector partners in regards to those that are unsuccessful in their applications, has it been positive since the implementation of this process, or does it remain a bit of an iterative process?
Probably a little bit of both, but yes, they are appreciative of information being received as early as possible.
And are there, seeing that this recommendation is implemented, are there any final comments or observations from the auditor's office in regards to this, or is it considered done and dusted?
You are correct.
Okay.
Yep, done and dusted, yeah.
I like that. No further questions on this, Mr. Chair.
Done and dusted. That's thanks to all that have done the work on this front. I would welcome a motion to conclude consideration of this chapter. Mr. Lemeg moves. All agreed? That's carried. We'll now turn it back to the provincial auditor for focus on Chapter 26.
Thank you. Chapter 26 of our 2019 report, Volume 2, reports the results of our second follow-up of our audit recommendations made regarding the Ministry of Advanced Education's processes to manage risks to service delivery from its unsupported IT system, the One Client Service Model System. The system is used to support post-secondary services like student financial assistance, training programs, and registration services. Systems running on unsupported infrastructure are at a greater risk of availability and security issues that could impact operations. There were 3 outstanding recommendations at the time of our follow-up. By October 2019, the ministry implemented all outstanding recommendations. From February 2018, when the Ministry and the Ministry of Central Services signed an amended IT service agreement, Advanced Education received sufficient information to enable it to manage risks associated with the system till October 2019, the date of our audit report. Obtaining the necessary information, such as end-of-support dates and estimated upgrade costs about its system, will help the ministry and other partners that use the system to assess risks to make effective decisions. Additionally, the agreement clarified responsibility for upgrading and patching IT infrastructure, and the ministry implemented a plan for these IT infrastructure upgrades and patches. Maintaining a plan to upgrade and patch the system over its expected remaining life will reduce the risk of security breaches that could expose confidential information such as student personal information. I'll pause now for the committee's consideration.
Thanks so much, and thanks again for the focus of this work. Of course, this all goes back to 2015 and your report. This committee concurred with these recommendations in 2016, and now we see the actions that have brought these through to implementation. I'll open it up to committee members for questions. Ms. Young.
Thank you. Just a couple questions on this, recognizing this is a recommendation with a bit of a historic nature to it. One question about the upgrade schedule and what I read on page 241 of Chapter 26, where it indicates that the ministry obtains cost estimates for planned upgrades from central services as part of its annual budgeting process. Are these cost estimates and I would assume eventually realized costs, are these considered under infrastructure funding, or is there a different way that the ministry would note and account for essentially critical IT systems?
In terms of how it's accounted for, depending on the type of upgrade, it would be capital or expense. So yes, depending, could be a portion of it.
Okay, and as this is housed within the ministry itself, not the institutions, this would be funding to the Ministry of Advanced Ed?
Correct.
Okay. So since, I suppose, October 1, 2019, have there been any breaches or realized risks as outlined in this chapter?
So the system is a very dynamic system, being 20 years old, and so there are occasional, what I would call more hiccups as opposed to breaches. We have had no significant breaches, no loss of personal information or anything along that line. But because the system needs to interact with other systems, including the federal government's student loan system and payment system, occasionally there are interface issues, but those have always been resolved in a very timely manner to the extent that we have not been in a situation where we have not been able to make payments to students, for example, on the student loan side of things. So again, there are bumps in the road, but nothing that we have not been able to manage.
Thank you. And in regards to this dynamic system, so I'm just thinking I am older than 20 years old, and I don't think I would ever describe myself as dynamic, so it must be quite the system. Seeing that the schedule included projects planned up to March 31st, 2021, since that, is there a new schedule? Could you speak to the planning and action since that time?
So as mentioned earlier, each of the partners within the one client service model has plans and are implementing those plans to move off of that system. And we are forecasting that by October, November of 2024, we anticipate that the last of the group of clients using the system should be able to exit at that time, and then the system can be sunsetted, data stored, et cetera. But in terms of sort of the ongoing maintenance and upkeep, that is something that we look at frequently because, again, it is a system that we are very much utilizing today and will continue to do so. And the same is true for immigration and career training and our regional college system. I think the only partner who has successfully fully transitioned away from the system is the Apprenticeship Commission. So again, that this one client service model is still very important to us, and therefore we have an ongoing sort of maintenance and monitoring process to make sure the system is viable and reliable.
Thank you. And as these other ministries and bodies transition off the one client service model, and onto their own independent systems, I suppose perhaps to back up, do each of these organizations currently have some sort of service agreement with the Ministry of Advanced Ed for utilizing the existing system?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then following the successful wind down of this, and I believe you said March 2024, perhaps.
October, November.
Oh, pardon me, October, November 2024. That will be the end of this type of formal relationship between those ministries and Advanced Ed as it relates to what will be no more one client service model.
Yes, that is the plan, yeah.
Okay, and so then all of the costs associated with that will be borne independently within those organizations and ministries.
That's correct, yes.
Perfect. And then beyond that, recognizing there's likely significant change in terms of the ongoing utilization of the system, as well as the transition to these new programs or systems, whatever they are there any significant changes to what has occurred between what's captured in this report as of 2019 and to date that you think would be relevant for the committee?
Well, despite the fact that it is a legacy system, we do continue to make minor enhancements where we can to make life for students using student loans, for example, which is the part of the system I'm most familiar with. For example, we have a student portal now where documents can be shared electronically with our student clients. So we do introduce modest improvements on an ongoing basis, but it's always that balancing act between investing in the old system versus, putting all of our efforts and energy and resources into the development of the new system, which we are in the midst of. So again, we have made enhancements over the years. We will continue to do that, but because the end date for the system is on the horizon, we want to be very prudent about any major expenditures on the old system because, again, we just won't get a tremendous amount of value out of those.
Thank you. And last question emerging from your final comments there. What cost is associated with the development of this new system? Understanding perhaps you're only able to speak to the system for Advanced Ed proper and not the other associated organizations.
Yeah, so the two that I would be familiar with would be the new student loan system, and I would estimate the cost of that new system at approximately $6 million over a number of years. And then the other aspect that we are more directly involved in is the new student information and enterprise resource management system for our regional colleges and Gabriel Dumont and Dumont Technical Institute. And that system I would put in the neighborhood of about $8 million all in.
Thank you. And this goes through the Ministry of Sask Builds and Procurement as a project?
I believe that is correct, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Any other committee questions at this point? Not seeing any, I'd welcome a motion to conclude consideration of this chapter. Moved by Mr. Gowdy. All agreed? That's carried. We'll kick it back over to the provincial auditor, and I believe they're going to focus on the last two chapters on our agenda there, Chapter 15 and 19. The last two chapters, I should say, for the Ministry of Advanced Education.
Yeah, thank you. The last two chapters for advanced education we'll discuss today relate to our second and third follow-ups on the Ministry of Advanced Education's processes to work with the advanced education sector to achieve the ministry's strategies for the sector. Achievement of the ministry's strategies include meeting current and future employers' needs and is highly dependent on the cooperation with post-secondary institutions. You can find the results in Chapter 15 of our 2020 Report Volume 1 and Chapter 19 of our 2021 Report Volume 2. There was one outstanding recommendation that the ministry use specific measurable targets and timelines to monitor progress towards achievement of its strategies. By September 2021, the ministry continued to make progress towards implementing this recommendation. By February 2020, the ministry, along with the participating post-secondary institutions, established 24 common measures or indicators that will enable monitoring of the achievement of the advanced education sector strategies. Of these 24 indicators, the ministry had collected data on 18 and released 3 public reports on them. By August 2021, the ministry implemented 3 initiatives with post-secondary institutions to monitor progress towards achieving these strategies. These initiatives include a performance framework, accountability reporting under multi-year funding, and sector-wide performance measures. However, the ministry had not yet set measurable targets and timelines for all these initiatives. For example, striving for a 5% increase in number of students participating in experiential learning by 2022. Having specific measurable targets and timelines will assist the ministry in analyzing and reporting on progress made by post-secondary institutions towards achieving advanced education sector strategies. That concludes my comments, and I'll pause for the committee's consideration.
Thank you for the work on this front. Thank you for the report that's been detailed to us as well from the ministry. I'll turn it over to the Deputy Minister for a brief comment and then open it up for questions.
I'll just say that we agree with the provincial auditor's recommendations, and as stated, we've undertaken substantial efforts to enhance this area and to enhance our use of specific and measurable targets and timelines to monitor progress.
Thanks for that. I'll open it up for questions. Ms. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps starting at the beginning, am I correct in my read of the introductory notes in Chapter 15 that the outcomes sought today are an evolution of strategy within the Ministry of Advanced Education first developed in 14-15 as the Ministry of Advanced Education Plan for 2014-2015?
Are you asking, did this process all start in 2014, 2015? Yes.
So can you perhaps speak by way of introductory comments about the evolution of the sector-wide indicators that the ministry is hoping institutions will report on from 2014 to where we find ourselves now, nearly a decade later?
So, excuse me, the indicators project, you're correct, did begin around 14-15, and the project was very much focused on sort of greater accountability, but creating a greater understanding of the outcomes and outputs of the post-secondary education sector in Saskatchewan. So you can appreciate that each of our publicly funded institutions, they do a great job of reporting, putting out annual reports, et cetera. But because they all have different mandates and just the nature of how institutions collect data, the definitions are often different, we decided to start this project so that we could speak to and about the sector as a whole. And again, a lot of work has gone into creating the indicators that we've been able to report on so far. And most of that work was about creating common definitions around something as simple as what a full-time equivalent student is, or a full load equivalent, or depending on the variable. And again, that sounds quite simple, I know, but across so many institutions that are all quite independent, a lot of work has been done to come up with those common definitions. So again, so we can speak to the sector as opposed to institution by institution.
Thank you so much for that answer. That really helps kind of clarify the questions. So I guess first simple question off the bat, I hope. It's indicated in the initial report in Chapter 15 that the ministry expects participating post-secondary institutions to be reporting on these indicators by September 2020. Has that occurred, or is it occurring currently?
This project began releasing reports in 2018, and to date, there's 12 reports have been published.
So yes, all eligible post-secondary institutions are reporting.
So the reports are information from all public credentialed programs, so the U of R, U of S, SAS Polytech, and the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies.
So of the publicly funded post-secondary institutions in the province, are there any who are exempt from participating in this project?
Well, it's not that they would necessarily be exempted from participating in the project, but it's because there are only a certain number of institutions in the province that actually grant credentials, and those are the 4 institutions that the Deputy Minister mentioned. Take regional colleges, for example. They certainly offer programs and deliver credential programs, but those programs are brokered through another credit granting institution, typically Saskatchewan Polytechnic or one of the universities, or it could in fact be a different institution as well. So there are only a certain number of institutions in the province of Saskatchewan that actually grant credentials.
Thank you. So perhaps my confusion, I was looking at note 6 on page 208 in chapter 15. And it lists the participating post-secondary institutions as the U of R, the U of S, Sask Poly, Luther Campion, First Nations University, St. Thomas More, St. Peter's, Gabriel Dumont, SIIT, and the 7 regional colleges. So those regional colleges would be covered off somehow under...
So are you referring to the sector performance framework as opposed to the indicators project?
Perhaps I am. I'm on chapter 15.
I mean, all institutions will be involved because we do involve all institutions around the table on the indicators project. But most of the data, and I think all of the data to date, is only from the credential granting institutions. So for example, if you're a student at a regional college, you will get a credential, but that credential will actually come from, SAS Poly, for example, or one of the universities. So to avoid double counting, we make sure that, we are only collecting the data from the credit granting institution. But certainly the other institutions will be at the table helping to make decisions around the data. But their data, to avoid double counting, will not necessarily be part of the process.
Okay. So perhaps I'm just confused about the data. I'm mixing the two somewhat similar projects in my mind. In terms of the Ministry of Advanced Education using specific measurable targets and timelines to monitor progress to achievement of its strategies, it is only those 4 institutions that are participating in the reporting.
So I think you may be referring to another initiative that we have underway with the sector, and that's our Saskatchewan Post-Secondary Education Sector Performance Framework. So in that case, we do have 16 publicly funded post-secondary institutions involved in that, and that includes the universities, Sask Polytech, Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies, Gabriel Demont Institute, and the regional colleges, and the federated colleges as well. And so in that case, the institutions would be providing us data related to the performance framework. That would include how they are doing in terms of providing a return on investment for the significant public funding that they do receive, providing us metrics, targets, and targets for each of the institutions, and how they're progressing on their own strategic priorities as well as government strategic priorities, and also identifying how they are measuring their areas of strategic focus and how they're achieving those areas of strategic focus.
So then for recommendation 3.1 in Chapter 15, which project is that speaking to?
So in terms of that particular recommendation, there are a number of initiatives underway within the ministry. We talked a bit about the Indicators Project. We have this sector framework as well. We have another initiative related to our sector expectations, where we have 5 expectations that our institutions are expected to deliver on. So it's a number of initiatives that we have underway to address that.
So then pertaining specifically to recommendation 3.1 in Chapter 15, are all of the publicly funded institutions that would fall under the Ministry of Advanced Education covered off within some variety of those initiatives that you've listed? Okay, so every publicly funded post-secondary institute in the province of Saskatchewan has to report on some combination of those measures up to the Ministry of Advanced Education.
So just one minor point of clarification. There are a number of affiliated colleges within the province. They are not included in this initiative, but they are relatively small institutions with a very limited number of students. So you would have institutions such as, say, Briarcrest. You would have St. Peter's College. You would have College of Emmanuel and St. Chad, St. Andrew's College, Lutheran Seminary, typically doing some very targeted and specific work, often theological in some cases.
And would those, and pardon me, what was the term that you used, affiliated colleges? Would those affiliated colleges have a different standard of reporting to the Ministry of Advanced Education, or is it fairly independent based on the individual nature of those? I can anticipate Briarcrest would be different from a formal seminary.
Yes, that is correct. So, for example, for St. Peter's College and Briarcrest, both of which have affiliation agreements with the University of Saskatchewan, there would be more substantial reporting because there are credentialed programming that both those institutions are delivering, whereas a seminary, for example, would be in a different category.
So perhaps a topical question, just thinking back to the news of current events in the province, more so in the K-12 sector over the past couple months, is the monitoring of all of these institutions, including these, what sounds like there's a greater degree of independence granted, obviously, to religious institutions in the province. Is there monitoring done that the ministry feels is equitable for both its outcomes and those of the students?
So I don't know that I can give you a simple yes or no answer, but just like our larger institutions where we do have a provincial act that governs the relationship, where we are reviewing board packages, minutes, financial statements, et cetera, we also carry out that activity with our affiliated colleges as well. But it's not necessarily something where we have a legislative relationship in place that we can demand that type of reporting, if I can put it that way. But we still have that working relationship because we try to maintain positive and very connected working relationships with all of our institutions. But I think it's also fair to say that we would put a lot more time into the evaluation of our larger institutions and their activities than some of the smaller institutions, but there still is a significant degree of oversight as well.
Great. So I guess final question on this, as I recognize it's not directly relevant to this recommendation, but is more so to the monitoring of institutions in the Ministry of Advanced Education. I guess for these smaller organizations, regardless of their nature, is how does the ministry monitor and ensure equity for students? Like, is there a requirement for all organizations funded through the Ministry of Advanced Education to adhere to the Human Rights Code?
So most of our smaller institutions, if not all, have some type of affiliation agreement with one of our larger institutions where the credit is actually granted from. And those institutions will be subject to many of the policies within that larger institution to make, and that brings a level of consistency to the approach across our system.
Thank you. So you said most. Are there any that do not?
Mind.
Okay. And I'm hearing that there isn't any specific requirement that institutions, recognize or adhere to the Human Rights Code.
It flows through their affiliate.
It flows through their affiliate. So if they're affiliated with a larger institution, like, for example, the University of Saskatchewan, they would have to follow all of the same obligations that that institution would in regards to.
That would be part of their agreement with the institution they're affiliated with.
Okay, so accreditation and things like that would depend on it?
That would be my understanding, but I can't speak to the details of each particular affiliate agreement.
Okay.
That would be my expectation.
Okay, we're having a chat over here. Does the auditor have comment on this?
Yeah, we were just surmising that I would think that the Human Rights Code would almost apply to all institutions. Yeah, just from a.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for that small tangent. Circling back to the recommendations included in Chapter 15 and some of the actions taken to implement these recommendations since the initial provincial auditor's report. It's noted that in 2021, the ministry launched the 3 accountability initiatives to improve oversight and accountability for the government's post-secondary, or pardon me, the government's investment in post-secondary education, which are then listed below. For the committee, are the officials able to speak to the high-level goals of each of these initiatives as well as the outcomes to date? listed are the Post-Secondary Education Sector Performance Framework, the Saskatchewan Post-Secondary Multi-Year Funding Memorandum, and the legislation, the Post-Secondary Education Skills Training Act.
So for the Saskatchewan Post-Secondary Education Sector Performance Framework, as mentioned, there are 16 institutions that directly participate in that initiative, and that would cover the vast majority of funding that the ministry provides to the sector. And as part of that process, the institutions are providing the ministry with data on sector performance and alignment with priorities. They would also be providing information on the return on investment and the value that is achieved as a result of the investment by the public in the institution. They would provide some data and targets for each institution in terms of what they're able to achieve. And they're also able to report back to us both on achieving the priorities that we set as government for the institutions, but also their own as well. In terms of the revised Post-Secondary Education and Skills Training Act, that now provides a consistent legislative oversight over what I would characterize as a very diverse set of institutions. So it helps to provide some clarity on that front in terms of what institutions are expected to do within their mandate within the province and how they would report back to the ministry. And then finally, with respect to the Saskatchewan Post-Secondary Education Multi-Year Funding MOU or agreement. So this was very much about creating an environment where the institutions were provided with some funding certainty over 4 years, but in exchange for that, they would report back to government, to the ministry, on activities undertaken to enhance sustainability and make sure that they, again, are delivering on their mandate. So what new revenue initiatives might they be pursuing to enhance the revenue situation? What might they be doing to manage expenses? How are they dealing with the impact of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on students? And again, what steps were they taking? And again, this helped us have a better understanding of the challenges that the pandemic created for our sector, but also how they were sort of progressing forward out of that context into maybe more of a post-pandemic environment.
Thank you. And it's noted in Chapter 19 on page 169 that in the 21-22 budget letters, the ministry set out required reporting for this performance framework. Do these letters go to all of the post-secondary institutions and yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Would have gone to all publicly funded post-secondary institutions in the province, yes.
And are those requirements individualized for each institution, or are they part of that kind of broader reporting striven for?
They are common across all institutions.
And are you able to speak to it details just shortly after that within the auditor's report that the ministry plans to provide further instruction to post-secondary institutions on the required information for the January 31, 2022 reporting deadline? How that evolution has continued, how it went, I suppose, for the January 31 deadline and how it's going to continue into this next year.
I think it's fair to describe it as an evolution. The early reporting was perhaps not as detailed as what we're seeing today. And so as the institutions better understand the expectations of the ministry with reporting, I would characterize them as doing a much better job in providing that reporting. And so they certainly have progressed and, as we would have hoped for. And it has given us better insights into some of the activities, particularly during the pandemic, but also as they emerge from the pandemic environment in terms of both their sort of financial health, but also how they're doing from a program delivery standpoint.
And on page 170, it speaks to an agreement of that same date of January 31, 2022. And just for clarification, that's the agreement that you spoke of that provides some certainty in the multi-year funding in exchange for.
It's the memorandum of understanding, yes.
Perfect. Are there any concerns, understanding it is an MOU, and achieving positive outcomes for the province as a whole as it relates to the goals of the post-secondary system is a shared concern and shared opportunity for the province. Are there any concerns with any partners perhaps not being able to fulfill these requirements?
I don't think I would use the word concerns. I mean, there's always certain institutions that may do a better job of reporting back than others. But I would say every institution is very cooperative, first of all, and I would suggest also that each of them is on a path that we are quite confident that we will have the information we need and they will achieve the success that they need to achieve as well.
Thank you. And are there any significant changes to the planned actions for implementation since that wouldn't be included in the update provided? Or is this fairly comprehensive?
I think it's a good representation of the expectations from the ministry. Now, what each institution is providing, that does evolve somewhat over time as they refine their plans. But in terms of our expectations, that would be fairly consistent.
Thank you. And with the current status of the recommendation being partially implemented with the actions taken thus far, as well as the planned actions for implementation, in the opinion of the audit team, do these actions implemented and planned meet the spirit of the goals of the recommendation?
So we will confirm whether or not it is fully implemented through another follow-up audit, which I would envision we must. We usually wait almost like 2 years almost from the point in which we've, I guess, done the audit originally, and then we do a follow-up. It's almost like within that 2-year time frame we go back, and then that'll be the point in which we confirm that it has been fully addressed at this point. But what the ministry is describing, I envision, it sounds like they're on a path to success, like you said. So, hopefully it will be implemented the next time we do go.
Thank you.
Any further questions by committee members? Not seeing any, I'd welcome a motion to conclude consideration of Chapter 15 and 19 respectively. Actually, well, let's hold on that. Mr. Gowdy has a question. Go ahead, Mr. Gowdy.
Sorry, on the Chapter 19, just the one point on expectations, employer engagement, responsive, meets the needs of students, communities, and the economy. How do they measure that? Like, we have so much unemployment, not because, or so many job positions that need filled across the province. How are we really doing? Because I've talked to a number of employers, just wondering, how are they, what are the metrics on that as far as engaging employers across the province?
So each of our institutions, given their mandate, would take a slightly different approach. But if I could speak for a moment about our regional colleges and Saskatchewan Polytechnic, given the nature of the programming that they deliver, they are expected to, and I know they do, spend a lot of time interacting with employers, businesses, industry, community groups to make sure they are meeting training needs. During the pandemic, I know that was disrupted somewhat because of the other challenges that the institutions were dealing with, but that is sort of foundational to their DNA as organizations. They must be plugged in, particularly our regional colleges, because they are expected to shift their programming very quickly to meet the local labor market needs. The only, I guess, point I would make is we've almost gotten to the point where, you know, it's pretty much every occupation where there is excess demand these days. And so, again, we expect our institutions to prioritize their training to make sure they are meeting, you know, the critical needs. But I know their task these days is a difficult one, because almost every program that they're offering is, you know, potentially highly valued by industry and community, but they don't always have the ability to attract enough students to fill that demand. And again, you know, that is a challenge our sector continues to face.
I'd be interested in seeing how they measure that, you know, as far as engaging those employers across the province, and how you balance the expectations in order of priority. You know, if you might have to modify some classes or expectations of what course load will be completed before employment, like because I think I know in our area that's the bottleneck of our economy right now is filling those positions with employees, and so it would be just interesting to see how they are measuring themselves on success in engaging those employers and how they're, you know, fulfilling their obligation to the province in that way.
Yeah, I know, for example, that the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training does provide data to our institutions on those national occupation codes with that highest demand or highest vacancy. And so the institutions do have access to some objective information. The ability to fulfill that demand, though, I think is maybe where the challenge exists, attracting students, available instructors. The only other thing I would maybe mention in terms of maintaining that connection with industry and business is, you know, Saskatchewan Polytechnic, for example, has a number of industry advisory committees that they utilize to make sure that they are plugged in. And that maybe speaks a little bit more to curriculum and making sure that the right skills are there. But I expect there's also communication around demand and need as well. But regional colleges, same thing. Again, they need to be talking to businesses, chambers, community members to make sure that they are offering the training that is most important to their region.
Sorry to ride this more, but just wondering how we can, as a committee, really be sure that what would the passing grade be on engaging the employers across the province? Like, what would that look like to pass for the auditor as far as institutions for engagement of the employers across the province? Like, what would sort of be the metrics that you would have to give them a passing grade on that?
Yeah, and I probably leave it to, you're right, to almost the institutions along with the ministry to come up with, you're right, what are we trying to measure? What are we trying to achieve? And really it's about those results. Where are we trying to get to? And let's baseline and find out, are we meeting the mark or not? I'm not sure I have any specific insights that I would share. I mean, there's often through, you know, some sort of survey mechanism, or like you said, it's probably about demand and supply numbers at the end of the day. What is those total program participants, and are those numbers potentially going up? And is that the amount of people they're actually putting through and that are coming out the door? Would be some things that kind of come to mind, but I probably leave it to the institutions who have a much better sense and vibe on with the employers what those targets, those measures, and really what are we trying to achieve, and reporting back whether we're hitting the mark, and if not, why.
So if you're the auditor of the institutions, in allowing them to give you their assessment of their own performance, how is that being their auditor?
Well, at the end of the day, we step back and assess what they've come up with, and we do make sure they do align with good practice or reasonable. But to some degree, they, again, know their business better, so I would like them to almost like, you go first, and then I tell you if you're off the mark.
Mr. Gowdy, any further follow-up on this line? If not, I'll move over to our Deputy Chair Hargrave.
Along the same line, is there any matrix that you follow in instructors or that the institutions are following in their instructors? I know of instances in where Saskatoon and Regina, for example, offer the same course, and they get 100% passing rate in Regina, and we had like under 30% passing rate on the identical course in Saskatoon. And so I'm thinking that something's got to be wrong with, I mean, we didn't ship all the dumb kids to Saskatoon and the smart kids to Regina. So I'm thinking it's probably an instructor issue more so. Are the institutions, do we check on stuff like that? Or like, is somebody keeping track of that?
I don't want to leave that on the, yeah.
So in terms of that issue of consistency and oversight of instructors, that would very much be in the purview of the institution and their board themselves and sort of their academic structure and policies. So, you know, other than from an expectation of performance standpoint, we wouldn't be directly involved in that discussion. But our expectation would be that if an institution is observing that type of performance issue, that they're bringing some additional resources to the table to help those students be successful. And, beyond that, like I say, it's really a matter for the institution to address as a matter of their internal policies.
Good questions. Not seeing any further questions at this point. We don't have new recommendations here. Of course, there's actions to see this through to implementation with respect to the recommendation in 15, but I welcome a motion to conclude consideration of chapters 15 and 19. Moved by Mr. Harrison. All agreed. That's carried. We'll take a real quick break, a couple minutes, and we'll focus in on the Carleton Trail College. And I guess, I would just thank you so much for the time here this morning, for the work, all those that are involved in this very important work and seeing this through to implementation. Any final comments from Deputy Minister Motza?
No, just thank you all for your time.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, brief recess. Carleton Trail up next.
Thank you.